New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer, you've been at the forefront of shaping Australia's science and innovation agenda. To set the scene for this morning's discussion, why has chip diplomacy become such a critical issue for Australia right now, and how do you see it influencing both our economic opportunities and our national security in the years ahead?
Well, I mean, I can pick up from the last talk, right? I mean, you know, semiconductors are such an integrated part of the global economy in every part of every supply chain, right? That if we're not a part of it, we're just not a part of the global economy, right? And I think that's ultimately why we are, you know, interested in it in general. I mean, you know, for us, the pivot point came when Jim Rabu wrote that semiconductor study for the New South Wales government back in 2019, and I think, you know, we learned from that there are actually a number of really great semiconductor companies in Australia, but primarily around things like design, you know, and niche areas. And I think there was an opportunity to really try and make a lot more of that, and particularly to focus on areas where we probably could make a contribution, like design, you know, like you know, compound semiconductors rather than straight silicon, and as we're seeing now, potentially in areas like packaging. I think it's, you know, and those are areas where we can help our, you know, looking at what Simon was saying, where we're actually starting to not build components but products. And where we're supporting, you know, industries, not just in defense, but in medical technologies, in consumer electronics and things like that. And so if we can really integrate ourselves into that, we can play a valuable role. And I think, again, I have to be honest, picking up what Simon said, we are sitting right next to the people who will fabricate the silicon for us. We don't have to do that ourselves, right? But all the other things that we can do. So I think this conference and the last one last year and, you know, the support that's gone into S3B and things like that are all part of building that a really important ecosystem. So, you know, I consider it absolutely underpinning for almost everything we do.
Thank you. And I might hand across now to Coby. We're not here to talk about Weebit, but we're actually here to stay on the geopolitical stage this morning. Can we talk about the global race in semiconductors? We all know how the US announced under Professor Biden a more than $50 billion investment in fab plants. The European Union announced a similar investment. China's investing billions. Everyone around us is pouring billions into subsidies and reshoring their efforts in the semiconductor space. By all accounts, Australia's far behind this race. I think we're pouring billions into infrastructure that a lot of people say we don't need. Can you tell us, is it too late, or is there still a window for us to compete meaningfully on the global stage?
So I personally believe that it's never too late. Australia has such a great potential in semiconductors that it's really crazy. Every time I think about it, it drives me nuts, because, you know, you're in a place where you have clean air, you have good clean water, no earthquakes, you have the rare earth materials which are critical, and nothing is done about it. Now, by the way, it's not that the government has to pour all this money in from its pockets. It's enough to give tax incentives. It's enough to give, I lost it? Oh, there it is. It's enough to create the right environment for it. And it's a mindset of the government that really does that. So, you know, when you look at small countries like Israel or Ireland or others, you know, the government put money in, but most of what it put in was tax incentives and the big players to come. So first of all, in the fabrication space, I think you have a great potential if Australia would just, this is interesting, if Australia would just decide that it really wants to promote manufacturing, I'm sure that many big manufacturers would love to come here and set up plants if you just give them the incentive. This is going to be very interesting. Beyond that, I think you have good engineers here, you have good schools. You know, I understand quite a few of the universities here are really leading universities. And setting up a fabless company is really not a big deal. You just really just need to create the ecosystem and the understanding of this market. And today, the investors here don't really understand, the institutions don't understand what semiconductors are. It's unbelievable, the biggest industry in the world, the most important industry in the world, and the institutions have no clue what we're talking about. So doing that education to the market is very important, and the market is running.
Thanks, Coby. I'll turn to Zoe now. So Zoe, the semiconductor race has become a flashpoint in geopolitics, from US-China export controls to Europe and Japan reshoring supply, and there's obviously the conversation around Taiwan. From your vantage point, how can Australia position ourselves to balance national security with economic opportunity?
I love these easy questions. Thank you so much. I think, so I'm coming at this from a perspective of strategy and policy and geopolitics as a think tanker, as opposed to being a technical semiconductor whiz or investor. So it's really exciting to be here and learn more about all the amazing things that are being done in Australia on that front. For me, I think, in the policy world, this question of what capability does Australia have on semiconductors has really been brought to the fore by this conversation around AI and this term AI sovereignty that we're hearing increasingly, whether you like it or not. And I think, so for us at the Tech Policy Design Institute, we're really looking at how do you step back and view that concept more holistically. And when you talk about strategy between balancing economics and security, really it's about viewing the big chessboard when you think about geopolitics. And I think sometimes, as much as we need to be super focused and down in the specifics of each individual element that builds into that full sort of stack of what makes up AI power, if you will, semiconductor capability obviously being a very important part, it's easy to miss, I guess, the way that those things interact with each other and the bigger negotiating and bargaining position that can be built. And so we've been running a project, a sort of national consultation, to ask this question of what is Australia's capabilities across all of those things. I mean, we've heard several of those things mentioned already. We're talking about skills, we'll talk about policy settings as well, infrastructure, and semiconductors being part of that. And so I guess my comment on that is keeping the big strategic picture as the background context to how we work out, as Hugh said, okay, which are the parts that we can meaningfully value add, and not take the view that we need to do all of those things that feed into the sort of AI ecosystem. We don't need to do all of those onshore. Which are the ones where we can do it meaningfully and really take that strategic big picture view, I think is how we make sure that we are investing our time and energy in things that will make a difference. It doesn't have to be all self-reliance from top to bottom. And then how does that feed into a diplomatic and negotiating position that we see play out potentially, what we're talking about, the announcements overnight, that comes from a bigger picture of a strategic chessboard. So the big picture is my comment on that.
Thanks, Zoe. Omer, you're a passionate advocate for the need for nations to build and strengthen sovereign capabilities in a deteriorating geopolitical environment. Can you talk to how the US is shoring up its global chip supply, and what should Australia be prioritising?
Okay, well, first of all, it's thank you for having me, obviously. And yeah, the US has been in the forefront of this reshoring, redomiciling of critical infrastructure, critical production, critical supply chains ever since COVID, when we found out that we can't even produce face masks. Then after that, the Biden administration with the CHIPS Act, and I think there's a lot of resources and capital obviously poured into this process. I think we don't have any other choice. We just saw JP Morgan announce that they're going to allocate about $1.5 trillion into redomiciling of supply chains, production chains, chips, obviously, and semiconductor is a big part of that. We all know what's going on in Arizona, and they're trying to replicate what's going on in Taiwan, and the semiconductor industry essentially built a similar or duplicate capability in Arizona. Again, I think this is something that we see, it's a bipartisan effort. Unlike almost everything that's going on right now, that's a lot of polarization, and we don't agree on a lot of things. But when it comes to the re-industrialization and bringing all of these capabilities back onshore to the U.S. and allied countries, the government is doing phenomenal job on both, again, excluding the shutdown and all what we see today. But I think Australia is a bit lagging in that sense. I know that from our experience, both, I've been investing in Australian companies. So another company that I'm involved with and a major investor is Amero. We had a difficult time when we wanted to essentially build the facility here in Australia. And it was much easier to do it in the US. So if I could say something to any policymakers, is just try to make it a little bit more business friendly and be aggressive. Be aggressive, because these are, I mean, you need these capabilities here.
Before I shoot across to Mike, if we can pass the mic down, just to remind everyone, we do have Q&A for a few minutes at the back end of this session. So there's a QR code on page 4 of your program. Please, if you want to ask questions, you need to use the QR code and type them in. Mike, as the founder of an Australian semiconductor startup, you're at the pointy end of building advanced technology here. You're right at the coalface. What are the biggest barriers you face in starting and scaling semiconductor innovation in Australia?
Yeah, sure, and thanks for having us here today. Actually, I think Australia is a great place to build companies. So let's talk about the positives first. So we've got great universities, we've got great people. I've had engineers working for me in semiconductor companies for the last 10 years here in Australia, and the people you find are very broad, they're system thinkers, they do a very good job, and they're pretty loyal. They don't move around as much as we see in other places like the US. The challenge is maybe the local market's not big enough, so you have to be global from day one. So like Simon said in his presentation, you can't build for a local market, you have to think global. And just because the industry is so small here, the talent pool of engineers is pretty small. So we need to either train them or kind of partner to train engineers. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge, just bringing people on and training them up.
Well, Ingrid, Cicada Innovations has supported hundreds of deep tech startups. What are you seeing in Australia's tech ecosystem? Where are our strengths and where are our gaps?
Yeah. So we've seen that, you know, we're really starting to hit a point where we've got innovations that could really boost our productivity in this country. At Cicada, we've been supporting companies that are doing quantum sensing, quantum computing, looking at packaging as well. And these sorts of companies are looking at solving problems around AI, for example. So how can you actually get the memory and processing for AI? How can you get the energy requirements within the chip for AI? And also looking at some of the scalability problems of quantum computing. And then we've also been looking at sensing and measuring. All of these are huge opportunities for Australia. But what we're seeing is great initiatives like S3B, like Quantum Australia, are actually seeing these companies being established, which is great, and we're seeing more of them. But as we've heard from a few people already today, we're investing really heavily in that early stage. And the challenge with that, if we don't start to invest in scaling these businesses, what we're going to find ourselves in is a situation where we're investing and putting all the effort in de-risking these companies only to see them being realised offshore. And what that means is that not only the economic and community benefits are realised offshore, it also is a diplomatic issue for us, because it means suddenly our strategic leverage is less than it otherwise would have been. So we've got to be thinking really big, you know, to Zoe's point, we've got to be thinking big picture about this whole opportunity for Australia.
Let's stay on the topic of investing. So we'll pass the mic back down, all the way down to Hugh, if we could please. Hugh, OCSE has invested directly into the semiconductor sector in Australia through the funding of S3B and companies like Scienta, through the New South Wales Physical Sciences Fund. How can government, whether it's state or federal, give confidence to private investment in Australia? And if you could identify, please, 1 or 2 national priorities in the semiconductor space for the next 5 years, what would they be?
Let me try and change the question first, which is my nature, okay? I think, number one, we've got to disabuse ourselves of the fact that we're going to be building a silicon foundry in Australia. It's just not happening, right? I've been to Taiwan a couple of times, and boy, they're so far ahead of even the US. Even the US are going to struggle to compete with that kind of thing. They are struggling to compete. But there are lots of things we do well here, right? Blue glass is a good example, where we really have strengths in, say, compound semiconductors. We have an amazing strength also, which I should not have been surprised at the beginning in communications, that came out of the original radiator experience and so on. People like Broadcom design their communications chips here, this sort of thing. So we have a lot of strength. And the question is, what I want to do is invest in places where we actually have a comparative advantage and where we potentially could go globally. And, for me, that means a couple of things. It means let's invest in design. And let's be clear, the biggest semiconductor companies in the world make nothing, right? They make designs, okay? Apple, NVIDIA, ARM, all of these companies make nothing, okay? So let's start at that, and, training and design and things. So what Atto's doing, I think, is right on the money for that type of thing. And then I think the other thing is, where are the other niches within that we're good at? Comms, yep, check. I think the quantum opportunity is there, and I'll pick on what Simon said. My take on this is it's here and now for quantum sensing, and we should be investing in these. We invest in a lot of quantum sensing companies, and there is a market and people making revenue out of it, and we have a real advantage. So let's double down on that. And let's pick, I'm not trying to pick anything, but when I look at the people who apply for our programs, which are all competitive, and those that are successful, that's what happens. Do you know what I mean? And like everyone's been saying, and doing that at a scale which the market is the globe. It's not Australia. And we do need to build partnerships. So again, we have an MOU with Taiwan, to make sure that our people can put prototype chips through, foundries in Taiwan, which is key to kind of making this happen. Last month, we signed an MOU with Singapore in packaging and quantum and other areas like that. We need to basically lean on those sorts of things to make ourselves relevant. I worry that sometimes, whenever we talk to the Commonwealth government about semiconductors, all they can think about is a silicon foundry, and they just don't do any. They don't think any further than that. So policy number one is to have a policy. Maybe this conference one of the outcomes of this conference should be a small working group that puts together a semiconductor policy. Do you know what I mean? And actually says this is what we should be doing, and actually just promulgates it and makes it happen. Because frankly, if we wait for the Commonwealth to do it, it is not going to happen. Okay? Sorry, I should probably stop there because I didn't answer the question.
No, that's all right. This is all a discussion. So maybe, Mike, if you can grab the microphone. Startups need to plug into global supply chains early. You're having this experience at the moment with yours. What does it take for a small player from Australia to build credibility and access in the international chip ecosystem?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand is building chips is really hard. So you kind of need to know what you're getting into. You need to, you can't just be 10% better. So if you're a small company trying to compete on the global scale, you've got other people competing with you, they're probably much bigger. You need to show something really differentiated. So I think the other thing we need to be careful of in Australia as well is not just convincing ourselves that we've got something really good. You know what I mean? We need to be competitive on the global scale. And so I think for small companies and I think for scale-ups and startups, the most important thing is getting that product market fit, the validation from customers, early design wins, things like that.
Thank you. Zoe, I might hand to you next. We're slowly sliding the mic back this way. Australia has demonstrated internationally that it has the regulatory courage to lead on things like tech policy and standards. I mean, we've seen it with, the age limits on social media that's been put in place, and also on governance frameworks. How has this impacted Australian investors when compared to our relatively unregulated international peers?
I'm going to do a Hugh and partly respond to that, but also partly respond to what you said. I completely agree, and I think that the problem, if we're looking at the policy settings and the question of regulatory context for Australia, the first point is, does the government actually even understand? We were starting with comparative advantage, so do we know where our opportunities are to have like a meaningful value-added competitive advantage, number one. But to do that meaningfully, you actually even need to know what the options are. And I think that's a massive knowledge gap as well in government. I mean, for myself included, being a non-technical person, and so part of the piece of work we're trying to do is bridge that, is to say, actually, what are the AI capabilities? If we're looking at through that lens, obviously it's broader than that, but in this particular project. And we've already come up with 90 plus categories, just having consulted with people of here are all the different types of skills and contributions that we could be making. So I think number one is, how do we get that common language set so we can all even talk about before we say what are the policies trying to achieve, if we don't know what the playing field looks like, how can you even do that, right? So there's a massive education piece that needs to be done between the technical and policy communities, and I think that being willing to take the initiative to bridge that gap, as Hugh was saying, with you know, to translate some of these issues to government so they can understand is super, super helpful. And to the actual question, I think that there is, you know, I'm obviously biased, having co-founded something called the Tech Policy Design Institute. I do think that there's value and merit in policy and regulation when done well, and I think that requires, as I said, the education piece, but I think where that's valuable and where it can be a competitive advantage is using that to create a trusted environment where things are done responsibly. And how can, you know, of course it's easy to make the comparison and say, oh, well, if other jurisdictions are having the let them rip kind of unregulated attitude, surely that puts us at a disadvantage. And I'm sure in many cases that may feel true. But I do think that particularly for certain things, you know, whether it is the development of models and applications in AI and things like that, that I think that doing that in a way that can be seen as responsible and trusted does change potentially a point of difference in the region. You know, I think that's been mentioned, our location. There's a massive market for us to be a responsible player in that space. So I think not viewing it only as making sure it's designed well and based on a true understanding of the situation, number one, and if it is designed well, maybe seeing it as an opportunity for comparative advantage as well.
Thanks, Zoe. We'll slide one to the right again. So, Coby, you touched on this earlier when you were speaking around the lack of institutional investor understanding of the semiconductor space. And it's clear that it's not a sector that, I mean, you know, Australian investors know about resources, they know about telecommunications, but deep tech is a struggle for a lot of Australian investors. Can you talk about the lessons you can teach the people in the room, the deep tech founders in the room, the other tech founders, semiconductor founders in the room today? Can you teach what lessons they can take from your experience around market education and getting investors on side?
Okay, so yeah, it's quite a challenge. I remember the first time I came to Australia and I started talking to people, and I realized that, you know, even the very basic things are not understood. And even I was talking about companies like ARM or others, which, you know, anywhere else in the world, everyone knows who they are. You know, you don't have an electronic gadget, you know, be it a phone or a tablet or whatever, that doesn't have an ARM in it. And people were looking at me like, what are you talking about? So it is a big challenge, but I think it's a combination of several things. As a CEO, what I worked on is just, first of all, simplifying the messages to the basics. And people know what computers are. People realize, in my case, that computers use memories, and I went to the very basics to explain it so that they would at least understand, you know, kind of in general what is going on, and I tried to, you know, I don't like the term dumb it down, but that's basically, you know, use very simple ways, and a lot of, use a lot of examples and things that they understand. You know, when I go to an institution and I say, hey, do you realize that 9 out of the top 10 market cap companies in the world are semiconductor companies? You know, then market cap they understand. So, you know, and I tell them, do you realize that, you know, NVIDIA and Apple and Facebook and Google, they're all basically semiconductor companies. They have a lot on top of those semiconductors and software and everything, but the core business is semiconductors. So, you know, you need to think of, and I showed them, for example, slides about just how much governments have been investing in semiconductors and how much companies have been investing. You know, you look at the huge investments of corporates like TI or Intel or Samsung or of course TSMC and others. So it's really all about putting yourself in their place. They don't have a lot of knowledge. You need to talk in their language about things that they relate to and show it to them. And hopefully there will be more education in general. That's what you can do as a CEO. Now, in the general Australia market, I really believe that there needs to be, you know, more education program, if you want to call it, for investors on what is this domain, what are these terms, because it is important that they invest in it. I think it's a national strategic need to have the institutions understand it so that they can invest in it.
Thanks, Coby. We'll hand the mic to Ingrid. So, staying on the topic of investment, so Cicada has become a hub for semiconductor companies in Australia with alumni including Morse Micro, Scienta, Turner-Enet and more. What role do precincts, incubators and accelerators play in chip diplomacy, and how can we better connect innovators into global opportunities?
Yeah. So I think you've heard from a number of people talking about how when you're talking about semiconductors, you know, they need to be thinking globally from the beginning. So that international connection is really, really important. Incubators are a really important part of that because they actually house an ecosystem. So if you think of a place like Cicada, we have S3B as a resident with us sitting alongside Scienta, Turner-Enet, Archer Materials, Millibeam, etc. So what can happen there and what we see all the time is this flywheel that happens where S3B are sharing insights with those companies, but those companies are sharing their insights with S3B, and S3B is distributing that information to the other companies that are working with us, and it's lifting them all. So you know, it's an intangible thing that is really, really valuable and really, really important. It also, it acts as a lighthouse. So if you think about diplomacy, it provides a front door for investors, for governments, for corporates to actually come and engage with the semiconductor companies that we have here in Australia, whereas if they were out in the wild, it would be hard to find them, you know, a whole lot of work. So we do a lot of connecting. I know we've got in the audience today a delegation from Vietnam that was with us yesterday. So, you know, these are the sorts of examples of how they really make a difference. And we have all the connections here. We've got a lot of connections overseas. We can do more. But to your point, I think we've got to be thinking about how we are not only educating investors, and we've seen things in Victoria, for example, where they're doing education programs for angel investors. There is no reason that we couldn't do an education program to try educate, you know, sophisticated investors about deep tech. And similarly, we could be looking at, you know, a landing pad type arrangement that recognises that semiconductors is not the same as cosmetics. And so you're going to need a highly specialised targeted program with very specialised connections with representation in Belgium, Japan, Taiwan and the US. So there's a whole host of things that we could do.
I'll do one more question for Omer and then we'll open it up to the Q&A. So please make sure if you've got questions, put them in via the QR code on page 4. Omer, you're a US-based tech investor who's bucking the Australian capital outflow trend. You've invested in significant time and money into 2 leading Australian deep tech companies, including Amero and Blue Glass. What do you find attractive about Australian listed tech companies?
First, I have one more investment, a company called Bionic, also ASX listed. I think what was mentioned here by the distinguished member of this panel is correct. On the one hand, Australia has great infrastructure in terms of great universities, great people, brilliant minds. It's a stable country with, they mentioned no earthquakes or very, so, and also it's a first world country with a great judicial system and good corporate governance. So from my perspective, this is a great opportunity. On the other hand, as people here, as Coby said, the market, the capital markets here are less, well, let's just say they're maturing. And you had mentioned it's mainly resource-oriented and potentially telecom, but when it comes to deep tech and more sophisticated technologies, it's less involved or people or investors are not really, it's hard for them to engage. So for me as an investor, this is a great, compelling opportunity because this is where you see all these valuation gaps between the US and Australia, for example. And this is why I started looking and investing in Aussie companies for these reasons. And I think, we talked about policy, and we see countries that invest in building this infrastructure that also includes education in business schools, in addition to investing in the infrastructure of the fabs and the and collaborations with companies like Intel and NVIDIA and others. So from my perspective as an investor, there's great opportunity in Australia, especially because of that gap. But sitting here, I'm telling you, you should look into how to close this gap, get the institutional investors involved, Australian Super, a lot of these guys that don't even look at Australia when it comes to tech should start looking internally also and help build this infrastructure, because it's not just about making money, it's also national security, as I mentioned in the onset of this conversation.
Thanks, Omer. So we've got a few questions that have come in from the floor. I'll start with one, and maybe Zoe, you might want to answer this one. Why are chips, except for quantum, not a priority for the Australian federal government, like they are in Europe, America, and Asia, and how can we fix it?
So first, a disclaimer, despite being a policy wonk on the panel, I don't speak for the Commonwealth Government, but why is it not a priority for them? I don't know that I think that's a fair characterization. I think that the government is grappling with how to engage on some of these issues. I think that the multiple moving pieces of the geopolitical dynamics of the broader supply chain at the moment mean that for the government, this is quite the extent to which to regulate, the extent to which to double down, how to run supply chains, that's actually all quite complicated. It always is, but I think right now, particularly with, I'm going to say President Trump, I do think that is complicated. So I'm going to give them a little bit of some empathy on that. But I do think it is front of mind. I know that the government has committed to put out a national AI plan before the end of the year. So I think, I hate to say the wait and see piece, but I do think that there has been a lot of pressure, rightly so. I think a lot of criticism that would have been fairly made that this is, particularly when you compare to other jurisdictions and the investments and strategic clarity that have been put out in the last few years by many leading jurisdictions, that maybe Australia's a little behind on that front, but I do think that the minds have been focused on that. So I suspect that we'll see a bit more over the next few months.
Thanks, Zoe. Another question, and I take on board Hugh's comments earlier about let's move past fabrication plants. We shouldn't be building billion-dollar fabrication plants in Australia. So I'll put this question to Mike, because I know that you would answer it differently, Hugh. The question is the decoupling of chip supply chain giving us an opportunity to start developing a sovereign end-to-end semiconductor and photonics manufacturing industry?
No, actually, surprisingly, I agree with Hugh on this one. I think we really got to focus on design. You've got to do what you can do, and you've got to do what makes sense. Do you know what I mean? So design's a very low barrier to entry way to enter the semiconductor market. As we talked about, many of the biggest semiconductor companies don't manufacture anything. In time, once we have a big semiconductor design industry in Australia, I think we can onshore parts of that supply chain that make sense, whether it's for national security, for defense, or for other reasons. Today, there's no way we can compete with Asia, Taiwan. Doesn't make sense yet.
The question's almost wrong in its framing, right? Because of all industries, semiconductors is not end-to-end. It's a lot of people playing in an ecosystem that specialize in very specific things, right? So AMSL being a good example in Europe, and so on and so forth. So, in that global supply chain, you've got to find where can you play and genuinely work globally, And I think for us, the design area is key. We have some very, very good designers here, and there are probably other pieces that we could work in. Pick out quantum sensing again, potentially compound. The photonics area is, there are a lot of interesting companies that could grow with photonics and semiconductors in general. So we need to find the right places where it will really make sense for us to do this. And again, I don't want to bang away at this, but maybe this conference is a place where you should say, well, where are they? What should we be doing?
Maybe one for Ingrid. As the tech companies, semiconductor companies get bigger in Australia and they start to focus on profits, how do we stop offshoring occurring to maximise profits?
Again, I'm not sure the framing is quite right. I think what we need to be thinking is how do we enable them to run a profitable business and be here? And I think a big part of that is, you know, we are talking about chip diplomacy and sovereign capability. It's thinking about how government can actually be a customer for, you know, for a whole host of these different solutions. That's pretty critical, I think, and also demonstrating how important the ecosystem is here in enabling the ongoing R&D is going to be really critical in terms of making the case for keeping people here.
Thank you. Omer, maybe a question for you, given your US-Australia perspectives. What initiatives or policies do you think Australia needs to put in place to make it more competitive on the global stage in terms of semiconductors and tech?
Well, I'll just compliment to what Ingrid said. I think today, and maybe we have an argument there, I think technology made it, I mean, the cost of capital, even in China today, is much higher than it was. So it's not about cheap labor. And technology made a lot of the cheap labor argument obsolete. So I think government, and Israel, by the way, is a good example, and Coby can maybe talk about it later. But for example, Israel initially with with National Semiconductor and then the investment, the government provided Intel with huge incentives to build these fabs and created a semiconductor industries. So it is the government at this stage, especially when we talk about these type of deep tech and technology, the government is the key to provide the infrastructure to build the ecosystem. So that's, I think, the key.
Thank you. One last question, because I'm conscious of time, and there's a whole bunch of questions coming in, so I'm sorry for those that we haven't been able to ask. So we'll finish with Coby. So last question. Weebit is currently in the process of scaling up, but there are a number of Australian semiconductor companies and tech companies that really struggle with the scale-up process. Do you have a perspective on what the cause of that might be, and how can we create some sort of a countermeasure to help Australian tech and semiconductor companies more successfully scale?
So I guess I honestly can't really talk about the other companies because I'm so focused on Weebit that I don't really look at the details of what's happening with them.
Maybe what have you been doing that can help other Australian semiconductor and tech companies scale?
Yeah, so I mean, in case of Weebit, we're really focused on just doing the job. I guess the first comment is, and Omer was saying it, it's really about the people. And if you want to set up a strong company, you need to look for the top-notch people, the best of the best, and that's been our very big focus, just bringing on board, if it's at the board level, if it's at the management level, if it's at the lower engineering levels, we're very, very focused on hiring the top people and making sure that everyone is focused on the work and doing the job. I've been focused, and I always tell people, you know, the company has a product and it has a sales team that sells it. The CEO's product is the company, and he needs to sell it to his customers who are the shareholders and the investors. And I've been very focused on, you know, making sure that the message goes out. I come out to Australia very often to make this work. So I think that's really the critical part, is building a strong team, focusing on the work, and making it happen.
I apologize again, there's all these questions we haven't asked. Use the opportunity in the break in the morning and the lunch to talk to all these distinguished panelists this morning. And thank you for your time.